Well, dear brothers and sisters, the theme that we heard in our readings this morning was that of a calling. We heard of how Samuel, the prophet, was called by God even when he was a child. And at first he didn't understand, but Eli helped him to understand and to respond to the Lord. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. In the gospel passage, too, we heard how Andrew and Peter were drawn to the Lord to follow him. And it was Andrew who actually helped his brother Peter, Simon, to come to follow the Lord. So that might bring us to the question, well, okay, who has a calling? Is a calling something that only priests and deacons and members of religious orders experience? Or do we all have a calling, like Samuel or like the apostles? Well, the Second Vatican Council, back in the 1960s, said that we have what's called the universal call to holiness. That is, we're all called to follow the Lord. We're all called to be his disciples. We're all called to live lives of holiness. And you might be familiar, some of us might be familiar with the Baltimore Catechism. If so, you might remember the question, why did God make me? Well, this is the answer the Catechism gives. God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in heaven. And it's kind of implicit in that very response, that understanding, that God has created us with this mission, this purpose. So in order for us to know him and love him and serve him in this life, and to be happy with him forever in the next, there's this implicit calling that God is doing this. He is drawing us to know him, love him, and serve him, and then to be with him forever in heaven. Now, how does God call us? That's a good question. We might wish that he could just ring our doorbell. And if some of us were alive, maybe 50 years or more ago, you might remember things like this. The Avon lady, right? Ding dong, Avon calling. And salespeople would come to our doors selling various products. We wish it were so easy, that Jesus could just show up at our door and tell us what to do. Maybe nowadays with modern technology, maybe Jesus could use another means, like our cell phones. Wouldn't that be nice? Jesus is calling. I better answer it. I hope I don't send him to voicemail. How does God call us then? Well, he speaks in various ways. We heard let me say first, we might experience simply a curiosity. Maybe if you weren't Catholic once upon a time and you had a friend who was Catholic, maybe just that curiosity about this friend. And why does my friend go to church? Why does my friend do this or that? And that curiosity might lead us to discover the Lord. Moses was kind of like that, if you remember. He was minding his own business, tending the flocks, and he noticed there was a bush that was burning and yet not consumed. And so he said, let me go check this out and see what it's like. And then God spoke. Sometimes God speaks to us through the circumstances in our lives, even difficult sufferings. We might go through a time of really feeling like we've hit the bottom of the pile, so to speak. And we might find ourselves on our knees calling out, Lord, if you even exist, please help me. That can be a beautiful conversion moment in which the Lord can maybe not speak audibly, but do something to help us along in our lives. And we know it's the Lord in a moment like that. Sometimes the Lord also uses friends of ours to assist us. So this was my college roommate, Guy. Here he is with me at my first Mass after I was ordained. And when we were in college together, Guy was a good practicing Catholic, and I wasn't. I was a cradle Catholic. I went through religious education, but after I got confirmed, I stopped practicing the faith. Well, that's because my family wasn't practicing, so I just didn't know that I had to go to Mass. Well, one day in college, Guy said to me, "Do you want to go to Mass?" And I said, "Okay, why not?" And maybe there was a little part of me, that good old Catholic guilt, that knew on some level, maybe I really should be going to Mass. So I went with him. And we went to this old church. It was called St. Mary's in New Haven, Connecticut. And it's a very beautiful old church. It was built in the 1880s. And they had a professional choir, kind of like how we're blessed to have such a beautiful choir here at this Mass. And this choir sang ancient Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. And I remember being there in this beautiful old church, just the way the music would sort of resonate in the whole church. And I was kneeling there, perhaps after communion, just feeling like I was being lifted up into heaven because the music was so profoundly beautiful. And that ignited something in me. It created a spark, as it were, a desire to want to experience that more. And that's what led me to start going to Mass. And little by little, I started doing more and more and going to confession and all that. Well, that's how the Lord spoke to me, and that was really my moment of conversion, as it were. But then, as life goes on, does the Lord continue to speak? He does. Because if we go back to this definition, that God created us to know Him, love Him, and serve Him, well, can we ever really know Him enough? Do spouses say to each other, oh, yeah, I know you enough. We can stop talking now. We can stop sharing and doing things together and all that. No, we always are thirsting. Even when we pick up the newspaper, right, we want to know more. We want to know what's going on in the world. We want to know what our sports teams did and all that. We're continually thirsting for more and more knowledge. And we're continually thirsting for more and more love. How many of us have experienced in our lives seeking after created things, whether it's people or food or the internet or whatever it is? And sometimes we can even fall into addictions and get stuck. But that's because our hearts are always thirsting for more, and we recognize that these things just don't ultimately satisfy. You see, our hearts are made for more. It's as if our hearts really are only half hearts. They're incomplete. They're meant to be fulfilled. But because our thirst for knowledge and love are infinite, our hearts can really only be fulfilled by God, by the one who is infinite. Hence, a complete, fulfilled heart looks like that. Jesus is the one, ultimately, who fulfills the deepest desires, the longings of our hearts. And so this brings us, then, to seek Him more, to try to love Him more, and to find in Him the deepest love that exceeds any human love, as good as human love is. It's the love of Jesus that exceeds that. And His love alone can fulfill the deepest desires of our hearts. So to respond to God's call then to this deeper relationship, this deeper love, last week, Father Matt gave us some wonderful resolutions: more prayer, more Bible, more love, more giving. And these are great ways to respond to the Lord's call to the more. Because the Lord is, as we said, always drawing us to something deeper. And so when we ponder, how can I pray more? We might think, well, I could come here to the Adoration Chapel and spend a little more time with the Lord. Maybe for some of us, if we have a little more time in the mornings, we might even try to come to a daily Mass if we can. That's a beautiful way to encounter the Lord more and to receive His love more in the Eucharist. And for those of you who want to discover the Lord in the Bible here, well, you still have time, as you've heard, to sign up for Scott Hahn's Bible study that will be starting on Tuesday. Scott Hahn is a phenomenal teacher, and he himself discovered that God was calling him to the Catholic faith. And so his thirst for the Scriptures and reading the Church Fathers led him more and more to discover the Lord and the Catholic Church. And so that's what brought Scott Hahn into the Catholic Church. And so I love when he teaches and preaches because he's amazing. So I encourage you to sign up for the Bible study and to join us on Tuesdays if you can. So why does the Lord do all this then? Well, we saw in Advent, we had this beautiful postcard that you probably received at home. And it was telling us that this beautiful story. There's this beautiful story, the story of salvation history. It's the greatest story ever told because it's the story of Christ, how he became incarnate for us, gave his life for us, died for us on the cross to take away our sins and to bring us to heaven. That's a beautiful story. But it's not just about Jesus. Who else is it about? It's about us. We are part of this story. The Lord calls us to have a part in it, to have a role in it, because the Lord is crafting a beautiful story out of all of our lives. And that's the good news, is that as we say yes to the Lord, as we respond to his call, as we seek him out to know him and to love him and to serve him more in this life, guess what happens? Our lives become beautiful. The Lord starts doing things in our lives more and more, and that thirst that we feel for him, we start to experience the joy and the fulfillment ever more in our hearts. And we experience his peace, the peace that we know this world cannot give us. And this is a beautiful, beautiful story. Just as an aside, sometimes the Lord's beautiful story is sort of, we see the beauty in it more at the end of at the end of our story than maybe in the middle. And that was one story I wanted to share about my aunt who lived near Chicago. I was living in Washington, D.C. I was a priest living in Washington, D.C., and she was dying. And I don't know to what extent she was practicing her faith, but her children called from the hospital room the day that she was dying, and it was a Sunday morning. And they knew that they had to call for a priest to come and anoint her. They knew that much. But, of course, it was a Sunday morning. Priests were celebrating Mass, and so there was no priest available. But they called me, and I said, well, one thing we can do is we can pray together over the phone the chaplet of the Divine Mercy. And if you've ever read the diary of St. Faustina, you know that Jesus makes wonderful promises to St. Faustina about the power of the chaplet, and he encouraged her to pray it by the bedside of dying people. And so we prayed the chaplet of Divine Mercy over the phone. I taught them how to pray it. We prayed it one time, and then we talked a little more, and then the conversation ended. And later that afternoon, I got a call back, and I found out that my aunt had passed away. And I went out for the funeral, and eventually at the reception afterwards, my cousins shared with me what happened. They said, it was amazing. After we prayed the chaplet together and hung up, then a priest walked into the room, and he anointed Mom, and then she died. That's a beautiful story. But it's even better if we don't wait for that moment, right? Don't wait for the end. The Lord is calling us not only at the end of our lives, but he's calling now. He's calling now. So if you hear his voice, how will you respond? Don't send Jesus to voicemail. Give him your yes. Tell him, here I am, Lord. You called me. I come to do your will.